It's my pleasure to introduce him. His name is José Carlos Bouso from Spain. He is a clinical psychologist and he has done his PhD in pharmacology. He published a series of peer-reviewed articles, has a large record of publication, has been involved in the study of MDMA, of cannabis, medicinal cannabis, ayahuasca, and he's also the scientific director of ICEERS, this NGO that promoted the World Ayahuasca Conference and that has a spot in the marketplace. So please welcome José Carlos Bouso.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Bia, for inviting me to this conference. The title of my talk is What Do the Spirits Do Towards an Understanding of the Psychological Mechanisms of Transformations. Of course, I will not talk about the spirits, but what I will try to do is a translation of what happens when somebody takes ayahuasca or takes some other plant medicine or a psychedelic. How can these benefits can be translated in psychological language or in a scientific psychological language. In the history of psychotherapy has been always very worried about outcome. You have a disease and you go to the psychotherapist, and the main focus, not only in psychotherapy practices, but also in psychotherapy research, is if your symptoms decreased. And in classic psychotherapy research and practices, we have always and also be focused in symptoms modification. But if we look at the different factors that depend of the outcome of psychotherapy, there are many ones. This is a classical figure from Assay and Lambert that says that only 15% of the outcome in psychotherapy can be attributed to technique and model factors. Another 15% can be attributed to expectancy and placebo effects. The 30% can be attributed to therapeutic relationships. That means what is the relationship between the therapist and the client. And the 40% of the outcome can be attributed to client variables and extratherapeutic events. So in classic psychotherapy that was very focused in techniques and all this fight between different models, different techniques, at last, all these different models only and different techniques only explain 50%. This is what in psychotherapy research is called the Dodo Bird effect. Everybody has won and all must have prizes. A quote taken from Alice in Wonderland. It doesn't matter what kind of approach or what kind of technique do you use. You will find at last the same result. That means 50% of the whole of the treatment. If we go forward, we can try to work in another 15% of the whole process that are expectancy and placebo effect. And in the 80s, there were this author, Jeremy Frank, with his daughter, that published this book named Persuasion and Healing, where they studied all the different psychotherapy models and also did a transcultural research looking for what have in common the different healing processes. And they found that it doesn't matter in which country of the world do you stay, if do you achieve a good psychotherapeutic outcome, there is necessary to have a confiding relationship between the people who, the psychotherapist or the shaman or the medicine man and the client. There should be a healing sitting. There should be a rationale, a theory, a model that explains how or why the changes are occurring, not just by random effects. There should be a therapeutic ritual, and in psychotherapy, in usual psychotherapy, there is a ritual where two people that don't know each other go apart from the social setting, and one person in exchange of money talk his problems or her problems to an unknown person. This is very strange in the story of humanity, this kind of psychotherapy. But this is a kind of ritual also, and it's based on rationale, and it's very necessary to create expectations of change and solution. That is hope. Hope, I think that is the main or one of the main factors in psychotherapy practices. So we can put the focus in the outcome variables, or we can put the focus in process variables. That is meaning, what are the different processes that are underlying the outcomes? What is happening? What are the psychological processes that are putting in to the table when we are doing psychotherapy? And since the 80s, one of the main process variables that have been studied is what we call the therapeutic relationship. That means, what is the relationship that the therapist and the client establish? And the client and the therapist should have the same objective. If the therapist thinks that what happens to the client is different from what the client thinks that is happening with himself, probably there will not be an understanding, and we will fail in this variable. That explains a lot of the whole percentage, that is a 30%. In the past, we did a clinical trial with a small sample with women with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, and we of course passed all these outcome variables, but also we use a questionnaire, the Helping Alliance questionnaire, that is used for trying to understand how is the Helping Alliance relationship. And we found effectively that after the administration of MDMA, there was an increasement in the Helping Alliance questionnaire outcome. So maybe the therapeutic alliance is a very important process variable in order to understand the final outcome in the positive results. And at last, we can put the focus in the client variables and extratherapeutic events. Well, this is what we are now researching in my foundation. Sorry. From what is named the third therapy generation, that the Hexaflex model belongs to that kind of therapies, where it's understanding that psychological inflexibility is in the core of every kind of psychological problem. When someone goes to the therapist or goes to the shaman or goes to the group therapy or whatever, because he or she has a problem, in the core there is something that is named psychological inflexibility, that is a difficulty to disattach from the feelings that the subject is experiencing, and when he or she is attached to that kind of feelings, it's difficult to progress in psychotherapy. And psychological inflexibility has some is connected with other different factors, by example, with dominance of the future or past, with lack of clarity or contact with values, with a lack of action or impulsivity, people's attachment to the story of oneself. There is a cognitive fusion. All the thoughts that pass through his mind or her mind is like the person understand that is the truth, and there is an experimental avoidance. People do lots of things in order to try to not front the problems, and people can start to drink alcohol or take drugs or do some problematic behaviors that at last finally do is doing things worse. So this model tried that psychological inflexibility can turn to psychological flexibility, where people can have clarity and be in contact with values, he start to do something to change, where the thinking and that are passing through the mind, well, not considered that are not always true, and that there was an acceptance of what is happening in their life. And to have a sense of the self, like, or as an observer. So one of every of these factors, there is a rating scale in order to measure it. And this is what we have been doing in several studies. By example, psychological flexibility has items like, by example, my painful experiences and memories make it difficult for me to live a life that I would value, or I'm afraid of my feelings, I worry about not being able to control my worries and feelings. If we can change of these things about oneself, we are moving from the psychological inflexibility to a more flexible psychological thoughts. Or another questionnaire that is used in this model is the experimental, is the decentre questionnaire that assesses experimental avoidance, that has items like, by example, I'm better able to accept myself as I am, I can observe unpleasant feelings without being drowned into them, or I notice that I don't take difficulties so personally. There are other measures of the Hexaflex model. By example, for the lack of clarity or contact with values, there is the engaged living scale that measures valued living. Valued living is the values that we have regarding ourselves, regarding others, and regarding life. And life fulfillment is the degree in which we follow our values. We can have several values, but when we are in the reality, not everybody, not always are congruent the values that we have with the actions that we do. And there are another, for measuring, by example, attachment to the stories of oneself, there is the experiencing of self-scale that have several measures regarding the self. Self in general, that is the self like where we consider that we are when we are in several settings. Self in social relations is how our sensation of the self changes depending of the social setting where we are. Self in close relations is the same, is how we consider ourselves the same person depending with who we are, and positive self is the sensation that we have the same sensation of self independently or the setting, the social relationships of whatever other reason. So using these different variables, and of course, combining these variables with classic outcome variables, we have been done several studies at ICERS, and I will present the results of these studies. We have been a study with people that have been never take ayahuasca and will take ayahuasca for the first time. We did in the past lots of the research with people who have a long history of taking ayahuasca compared with people who have never taken ayahuasca, but we have very little information regarding what happens when one person will take ayahuasca for the first time and what are the reasons why this person stops of drinking ayahuasca. Not everybody that start taking ayahuasca keep their use of ayahuasca, and this may be by many reasons. This may be by the price of the ceremonies, this may be because the feds they don't like, or maybe because there are secondary effects or side effects, or maybe for many different reasons. So we did this study where we assessed with a psychiatric interview before taking for the first time, and we then a follow-up at 1 month and 6 months after. We also have this study where we take the measures of these people who have never taken ayahuasca but will take ayahuasca for the first time and compare the measures with subjects that have taken ayahuasca at least 30 times in their lives. We also did this study that Deborah Gonzalez talked about it the other day, assessing people after attending ayahuasca retreats. We have this other study where we did the classical study of comparing subjects with no experience in ayahuasca use with long experience in ayahuasca use. And we also have this other study assessing these same variables after holotropic breath work. Well, in what we found in the psychological inflexibility questionnaire in people who will take ayahuasca for the same time, that there is a little improvement in the follow-up measure regarding the pre-assessment, but this little improvement decreased at the 6 months. It seems like if normal people these were normal people with no with any important psychiatric disorder, we didn't find anything interesting in that measure. But when from this sample we extracted the ones who had some kind of psychiatric symptom in the psychiatric interview, is when we saw the dramatic benefits and the dramatic changes in the AQQ2 questionnaire. So it seems that it's people with psychiatric problems who benefit better of the ayahuasca experiences and who drop or who can able to improve their scores. This is very interesting because here we compared this sample that will take for the first time, but they did not took yet, and we did not find any difference compared with long-term users. The only difference that we found was in a personality trait that is called self-transcendence. This is a very interesting result for me, because all the previous studies that have been done before were comparing long-term users with a matched sample of non-users. And we found differences in personalities. But in this case, so we don't know what are the reason of these differences in personality. But in this case, these were the group that in few days will take an ayahuasca compared with people with at least 30 ayahuasca experiences. And there are not any difference in personality, only in self-transcendence. And it's curious because the variable that we see that is changing a long time after ayahuasca use is self-transcendence. And in a previous study that we did with Neuroimagine, we see that self-transcendence was the only personality measure that correlated with some changes in cortical modification. So the changes in self-transcendences is related in some way with the use of ayahuasca and the changes that in the brain produce ayahuasca. Well, in this study that was done in the temple with a very big sample of 192 persons, we also see a change in the centering. And when we separated the sample by pathologies, we also see the other slide was for healthy people. This is for people with pathologies. They also changed it after a 3-week retreatment in the temple. But when we separated by specific diseases, we also changes in these measures of in these process variables in the centering and in psychological flexibility. And we also saw changes in the principal outcome variables. So like I'm finished. My general conclusions of all of this is, in general terms, there are no difference in classic psychopathology symptoms between users and non-users. The process variables that we saw that are more consistently modified are EQ, AQQ2, and some aspects of the selves, also some personality traits. And it's possible that people with pathology are the ones who obtain a better benefit according with process variables. And I encourage all the researchers to include process variables in the research in order to try to understand why people change at last. Well, thanks to my team, Daniel, Maria Sousa, Alba, Francesca, Deborah González, Jordi Cantillo, Irene Pérez, and Marc Aisala. There were all the people who participated in all these researches. Thank you very much, and sorry for...
Questions? Who wants to make questions can come here.
Do you have correlate between the values, living one's values and that self-transcendence? Like, is there any measure of that, if that self-transcendence leads to that living?
Well, these are results from some different studies, and we did not use the same variables in all the studies. We started to use these variables 3 years ago, and we are little by little trying to include some of these variables in our researches. But no, we have the results in some of in the first research that I show you. We have the results, but we did not the correlation. We don't need, these are preliminary data. We did not perform the correlation analysis. We will do it in some day when we finish the studies and we start working with all the data. All of these are our preliminary ones.
That's okay. Really good talk, thank you. I'm curious, one of the big variables in ayahuasca work is the quality of the ceremony and the quality of the songs, the ícaros, etc. How do you account for that in the research, or how would you suggest accounting for that in the research?
Well, this is the 1 million question that I have no answer. It's very difficult to, in the study of the Temple of the Way of Life, they do the ceremonies in the same way. So in some way, all the subjects have been passed through the same processes. And in the other studies, this is not so well controlled. By example, in the study we did the follow-up from comparing the scores in people before taking ayahuasca for the first time, and then at 1 and 6 months at the follow-ups, the subjects came from different ayahuasca providers, so it's very difficult. But in the study of the Temple of the Way of Life, that there is a very big sample and the process is very similar. In that way, we can see that this variable is in some way controlled.
Thank you. Thank you again, José Carlos.